Good afternoon and welcome to today's MSU Alumni Association Professional Series webcast, Mastering Grad School Entrance Exams. My name is Lisa Parker and I am the Director of Alumni Career and Business Services for the MSU Alumni Association. Pleased to have with us today John Rood, 2005 alumnus of Michigan State, to provide some valuable insight into these grad school entrance exams. In the Alumni Association, we do hear regularly from Spartans, whether they are recent graduates or alums who have been in the field for a while, who are trying to get some insight into how to tackle these entrance exams. There's anxiety around the tests themselves and a lot of questions about how to really set the stage to have the positive outcome that we're seeking when we take these tests. So John Rood, as many Spartans do, stepped up, reached out to me and said, you know, if there's any way I can help Spartans, please let me know. And if anybody says that to me, I find a way to use you. So John is an experienced presenter on this topic. He's presented for our own law school here at Michigan State. He joins us from Chicago. You will occasionally hear a train in the background, but we will get through that. And without any further ado, John, I will turn the mic over to you.
Well, thanks, Lisa. I sure appreciate the intro, and I'm happy to be here helping my fellow Spartans. A little bit about me, just for some background. It's for the last now it's 5 years. I've been founder and president at Next Step Test Preparation, where we do all one-on-one tutoring, and we work exclusively on the 4 graduate level exams, which we're going to talk about today. So I know a lot about this topic because this is what I do every day. I'm a graduate of Michigan State. I went also at the University of Chicago. If there's any James Madison College grads out there, I was a Madison guy back in my day. We're going to talk about 4 things today. The first is we're going to talk about business school, then we're going to talk about kind of general grad programs, which is kind of a catch-all, talk a little bit about law school, and then medical school for just a couple minutes. The format that I like to use going through here is, I thought that, you know, when we have students call our company initially, they want to know about the test, but they also want to know a little bit about just how the whole process works. So given the time that we've got today, I want to go into a little bit about the process of applying for graduate schools, and it's different for each one, and then we'll talk a little bit about the associated exam. So we're going to start, for those of you, and I'm willing to bet there's quite a few of you that are considering going to business school. Mostly that's MBA, a couple other programs. Some people will probably be interested in PhDs in business, but usually not many. As you think about your application for business programs, there's a couple different things that the admissions committees are going to consider. The biggest are the 3 that you see there on the top. So your GMAT score, which is what we're going to talk about in a second. But equally as important is your grade point average as an undergraduate. One of the better things about business school applications is there's a lot more leeway there. So whereas to go to one of the top law schools or one of the top medical schools, most students will need a 3.6 to 3.9 GPA. Oftentimes at the top business schools, there's a little bit more leeway into 3.4, 3.3. The personal essay is also really, really critical, and it's especially critical in MBA programs because one of the things that they're trying to do in the admissions offices is create quite a bit of diversity, not just in terms of the different backgrounds of students, but also what sorts of companies have they come from, what sorts of job functions did they serve, and the way that you explain that is in the personal essay. So that's a really critical part of this process. The things that are still important but less important are field or industry. And you just heard me say that that's an important aspect, but it's not so much where you come from, it's kind of how you explain it. So a student that kind of can tell a tale about how they came out of a background studying poetry, and can tell a very compelling story about how they're now transitioning into getting an MBA, that could be a great applicant. Whereas someone that just said, oh, I've done this kind of unrelated thing, and it seems like, business school kids make a lot of money, that's not going to be as good of an explanation. Letters of recommendation are also quite important. Not a lot to say there. You've got to get them. You don't usually need that many, but you do have to start thinking ahead of time about who's going to write those for you, and you want to make sure that they're not rushed. If your supervisors at work are like everyone else's supervisors at work the world over, it's probably the case that they've got lots of things going on, and if you're trying to hit a deadline 3 weeks out, that might be a little tough. So try to plan ahead for that. Education and work experience is also really important, but like I said, the MBA programs, especially now, are trying to create a little bit more diversity and not just have a class that's full of investment bankers and consultants and people that were in general management training programs. So if you've got a different kind of background, if you're someone like me who studied political science and went to grad school in political science, that's great. You just have to kind of tell the story. No background really is going to eliminate the chance of you being able to go to business school. I want to talk a little bit about the timeline, and this is from the perspective of probably about the top 100 or so business schools. Past that, if you're going to a more kind of local or regional commuter school, oftentimes the admissions deadlines are way later, but for most top MBA programs, they'll go through several rounds of applications. Usually it's 4, once in a while I've seen 3. And each round, of course, has got its own application deadline and a time where the decisions are going to be made. So this is one that I just copied from the Rood School at Michigan State. So the first application deadline, this is, as you can see from last year, November 4th, and then January, then late February, and then mid to late April. This is pretty typical. One of the things that you really want to be planning for after you've seen this information is you want to be planning to get your applications in by one of the earlier deadlines, if at all possible. Usually that means round 1 or round 2. So if you're just now thinking about business school and it's July 11th, yeah, maybe if you put things together pretty rapidly and you got some time to spend on it, you can hit round 1. Otherwise, do round 2. The reason that's better to go earlier is that your chances of admission actually go up a little bit. Earlier on in the cycle, they've got more seats to fill. They've generally got fewer applications than they will later on. So the earlier you apply, the better you tend to do. And in fact, oftentimes I'll counsel students who are wondering, what do I need to do to get into business school? Do I need a better GMAT? Do I need more work experience? And sometimes it's just that they'd already applied but done it round 3 or 4. And if you're kind of an average level candidate, you're much more likely to get in earlier. I think that if you're a typical MBA student, which means that you've probably got a full-time job and it's probably pretty demanding, so it's probably more than 40 hours a week, I suggest thinking about 4 to 6 months to plan for that application process. Now, if you got a different arrangement, whatever it might be, you can definitely shorten this a little bit, but not by too much. The couple of things that you want to spend time on are GMAT preparation, which of course we're going to talk about a little bit, writing and editing those personal essays. And that's the one that always takes vastly more time than you might think. So please don't think that that's something that you can knock out over the weekend. That's something you really should go through a couple iterations of and also show to some other people and even possibly some professional editors. And then of course, those letters of recommendation. Now Matt has asked, who should the letters of recommendation be from? Superiors in your current company, past employers, customers, all of the above. I think that all of those above are pretty good. So probably the typical level is from a superior at work. Sometimes it can be tough to get those because you of course have to tell your superior that you plan to leave in the next year. So I know that that can be a challenge. You want to make sure it's someone that knows you really well. With all of these exams, the best letters are those that are written by people that know you better as opposed to people with fancier titles. So, for example, I worked at a small consulting firm, and the owner of that firm, this is several years ago, was kind of a big shot consultant. He had a professorship at one of the top schools, but I didn't work as closely with him. So you really want to think about getting from the people that know you the best. Usually that's a superior. Once in a while you could consider a peer, although that's probably not as good. Customers are good too, I think, if they've known you for a couple of years. Okay, and the last thing is that every year I get lots of calls from people that say something like this. They say, that all sounds great in terms of what I need to do, but I got a real challenging job and family obligations, and I volunteer at such and such a place. And just know that it's a hard process and it's kind of supposed to be hard. So there's not a lot of people out there in my experience who can just spend full time preparing for their MBA. Everyone's working too. So make sure that you spend some time on it, but know that kind of everyone else is going to be in a similar boat. So a couple of words about the GMAT, Graduate Management Admissions Test. The contents are as follows. There's a quantitative section, which means math, which is the part that most people are concerned about initially. There's a verbal section, which has a couple different types of questions. So there's reading comprehension questions. There are sentence correction questions, which are about writing with clarity and proper format. And then there are critical reasoning questions, which test your ability to think logically through a given set of arguments. There's also a short writing sample. It's not particularly critical, but you want to do well on it. That's one of those things. There's a couple of sections like this in the future test that we'll get to, where your goal on the writing section is kind of to not embarrass yourself. So to get a score that's good enough to ignore. And then was it last year? I think it was last year now. They've added an integrated reasoning section, which is effectively asking several hard questions about how well you can read charts and maps and analyze data. The GMAT is scored from 200 to 800. The national average is about 540. Now when you think about that score, that's actually just the composite of the quantitative and verbal sections. So when we say that the writing section and integrated reasoning are a little bit less important, that's kind of what we're talking about. Because of course, the business schools get all the scores, but the first thing that they're looking at is on that 200 to 800 range. You'll have to look up for your particular set of schools what the acceptable range is for GMAT scores. Most schools don't necessarily have a cutoff, but they try to give you some sort of idea on their website, sort of what is kind of an acceptable range. So sometimes they'll give you the median of their admitted students' GMAT. Sometimes they'll give you a range like the 25th through 75th percentiles, and you do want to make sure that your GMAT score is going to fall somewhere within that range. If it's well below, that's going to be a challenging place for them to admit you. A couple of questions from Roy, starting out here with the GPA. Do admissions take into account the field of study which the applicant attained their undergraduate degree? Yes, they do. It's important to just get a good raw GPA first of all. So starting off with kind of the shorter answer, which is you just have to have a higher one. Partially because when business schools report their numbers, whether it's to U.S. News or to accrediting bodies, one of the things that they just have to report is, here's the GPA, and there's not a lot of ways to explain it. That said, when the admissions committees start to look a little bit in more detail about your application, yes, they'll absolutely see that different programs have different levels of difficulty. So, a student that's coming from a top school that studied a very challenging program, especially if it was in the hard sciences, oftentimes can get in with a slightly lower grade point average than someone who came, for example, from a less challenging undergraduate institution that studied something in the humanities or social sciences, maybe we should say. And I'm a social sciences guy myself. So, if you were in the nuclear physics program here at Michigan State, you're going to be in pretty good shape if you've got something basically into the threes. Guest has asked, are they looking at the core GPA obtained during the undergraduate years? Yes, that's what we're looking at. Undergraduate grade point average. If you have other graduate programs, so if you've gotten a master's in the meantime, certainly they'll take a look at that, but generally not as important as that core undergraduate grade point average. Great questions, guys. Keep those coming. A couple of words about how admissions committees think about the GMAT. A lot of times I'll just get students that just start by asking, hey, why do I even have to do it? And it's really important for a couple different reasons. The first is that it normalizes those grade point averages. So exactly to Roy's question, certainly they know that someone who comes to business school with a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago, probably their grades are going to be a little bit lower than someone that came from a regional commuter school and studied communications or the social sciences or humanities. That said, they don't always have all the data in between all of the schools. So one of the ways that they can kind of normalize this is to have something that everyone has to take that gives them the same data. So that fundamentally is the function of the GMAT. Secondly, though, it can also normalize experiences across careers. So one of the biggest challenges that a lot of students have is, when you think about what's tested on the GMAT, there's the big math section, and then there's the big verbal section, and then there's a couple other sections. But think of it from the perspective of the business school who gets an applicant from someone who is in marketing, for example, and they've been a brand manager. So of course they deal with numbers. Everyone in business has to look at spreadsheets, but they haven't got the same quantitative background as someone who might have spent 2 years at a major investment bank. So one of the things that the GMAT does, which is actually good for the applicants, is that if you don't have a lot of hard quantitative experience in your background, doing well in the GMAT quant section can kind of assuage fears that you wouldn't be able to cut it in corporate finance once you get to the MBA. The other side is equally true. So students worry more about math, but especially for applicants who are international, for who English is their second language, or who really come from just hardcore quantitative backgrounds, the verbal section can also help quite a bit in understanding, is this person who can also communicate very effectively in addition to just being a genius with the numbers. Finally, it's really testing, are you the sort of person that's going to be able to cut it in business school? So you're going to have a lot going on. You're going to have very short deadlines. Are you the kind of person that's able to, sit down, prepare for something, and then go do well for it in a time stressful environment? Because ultimately that's what business school, at least in part, is going to look like as well. Okay, a couple ideas about studying for the GMAT. These are going to be pretty general. The first is I think you should definitely take 2 to 4 months to prepare. I've seen it done in a month, but what I always tell students is that if you have a month or less, sure, you can meet your goals, but you probably won't get your best score necessarily. So, if you took your first diagnostic test and you scored a 600, which is a great starting score, and the score that you needed for school was 620, sure, you can get up those 20 points in a month. But 2 to 4 months is what most students should plan for. Secondly, the place where I would suggest starting is to take a free diagnostic from the Graduate Management Admissions Council. So their website is gmac.org. You can download software that's got some past GMATs, which you can take. It's totally free. And the reason that you do that is you really want to have some idea of where you're starting, because a lot of students have no idea. And honestly, I had no idea when I first sat down to take the GMAT. I knew I wouldn't do as well on the math, but was I terrible? Was I close to where I needed to be? And without that, you can't really put together a study plan. And with our students, that's the first thing that they always do. Unless you are a quantitative super genius, you want to begin with a review of the basic math concepts as well. This is the stuff that people have often forgotten. So for those of you out there that don't know how to, for example, factor, for those of you that have forgotten what you have to do to multiply exponents, those are the basic mathematical concepts that you want to pick up immediately, because that's kind of the assumed currency later on as you get into some of the challenging GMAT questions. Whatever else you do for preparation, you want to make sure that you're working through a lot of the past actual released GMAT questions, which again are also available from the Graduate Management Admissions Council in their official guide series. So if you just Google, GMAT official guide, you get this this really ugly teal book that I think is like 500 or 600 pages. It's got 1,000 past GMAT questions. Those are the ones where you want to focus. Now, past those basic ideas, there's so many options for preparation. So we mentioned our company does private tutoring. That's one option. You've probably seen the kind of group lecture style courses where 25 people get together, one of the big national companies, and they've got one instructor that talks them through the material. And then especially over the past 3 years, there have been so many more kind of videos and iPhone applications. And if that fits your learning style, great. If what fits your learning style is you're going to go get a couple great books and then do a bunch of practice problems, that works for a lot of students too. All right, any pending questions, I guess, on this kind of whirlwind 20-minute tour of the MBA admissions process? Okay. You can keep rolling those in, and we can cover those at the end too. The second topic I want to cover today is general graduate programs and students that are going into graduate school that will need to take the GRE, the Graduate Record Examination. The world of kind of graduate programs that accept the GRE is absolutely massive. So whereas for business school, the only reason to take the GMAT in the whole world is to go to business school. In terms of the GRE, there's a lot more diversity in terms of programs. So this is everything from very competitive master's or PhD level programs. So, the #1 ranked nuclear physics program at MSU, professional programs. So especially, our company works with a lot of students that are going in to get advanced degrees in nursing. We work with a lot of physical therapists, occupational therapists, a lot of physician's assistants programs require the GRE. Those two kinds of programs definitely will require the GRE in almost all cases. There's also a lot of programs that don't, though, so you should be sure of what the requirements are for your particular program. Particularly, less competitive professional programs won't require it. So oftentimes, if you're going to a little regional private college to get a master's in education, for example, which almost all teachers eventually will, that's a place where oftentimes they won't require the GRE because the programs are a little bit less competitive. They're not necessarily trying to whittle down 1,000 candidates into 15. Maybe they're trying to just say, of the 100 applications that we got, let's make sure that we're admitting people that can make it through, but after that, we're admitting most of them. If you're thinking about a for-profit university, almost never do they require the GRE because, then less people would apply. So make sure that you take a look and understand what you need to do. If you have to take it, if we're a competitive program, that's kind of what we'll talk about now. Application deadlines, similarly to before, but these vary for graduate programs way more than for any other type of program. So for really highly competitive and selective PhD programs, oftentimes the range of application deadlines can be like early December through the end of January. I think when I'd applied to graduate school, I think December 1st was my deadline. I feel like they've been creeping back a little bit, but it depends on the program. Even within a university, they can be vastly different. I've seen even within a division. So, a particular university in the humanities department, and the deadline for the philosophy program is totally different from the deadline for the English literature program. Professional programs usually have a little bit later deadlines, so usually in the spring, but oftentimes are rolling in their admissions. And this is a concept that we'll actually come back to when we talk about law school and med school as well. Rolling admissions simply means that instead of the admissions committee waiting to get all 1,500 applications they're going to get, and then in like a marathon 3-week sprint with no sleep go through all of them at once, instead rolling admissions means that once the application deadline, once the applications have started to come in, once they're accepted, they'll start making decisions on applicants kind of as they come in. So with any rolling admissions program, your chances are going to be better the earlier that you apply in the process. So even if you've got a July deadline, you'd like to get your stuff in as soon as you can. Non-competitive and for-profit programs often accept applications much later, sometimes into the summer. Oftentimes, non-competitive and competitive professional programs will have a couple start dates. So oftentimes, for nursing programs, they'll have a fall start, but also a spring start, and sometimes even a summer start. So take a look at that, and then of course that adjusts the timeline for the GRE. And then of course, depending on the program, what they're looking for in terms of GRE scores is going to be just vastly different. So for most of our, for example, physical therapy and occupational therapy students, the goal for their programs to get kind of an average score for the program is an average score on the GRE. Whereas if you're applying to the economics program, PhD program at Stanford, probably the scores need to be pretty close to perfect. Similarly to MBA programs, think about spending a couple months putting all this stuff together. The more competitive the program, probably the more time that you want to spend, but this is just never stuff that you want to have waiting until the last minute. So a couple words about the revised GRE. Superficially, it looks a lot like the GMAT, actually. So there's quantitative section, there's a verbal section, there's actually 2 of those sections each now. So it covers the same content. But one of the interesting things about GRE and GMAT actually is that the test is adaptive. So as opposed to every student that sits for it on a given day sees the same questions, instead they start you off with kind of a medium difficulty question, And if you get it right, you get a harder question. If you get the question wrong, you get an easier question. So that's kind of how it's able to narrow down on a particular score. Each section of the GRE is on a 130 to 170 scale, so you'll then add up your two scores. So you could get a 150 in verbal and a 150 in quant and end up with a 300. You do get access to an on-screen calculator on the GRE, and we'll talk about strategically what does that mean for you in a second. And then you also get to review your questions before you submit each section. So on the GMAT, once you've selected an answer, that's it, right? Then you move on, it scores it, and then gives you a new question based on that. But for the GRE, it's adaptive by those sections. So the first quantitative section will get scored, and then after that, they can give you a different quantitative section that'll be harder or easier. But within the section, you can move back and forth a little bit, which is a recent development for the GRE. The biggest challenge that I hear from GRE students is simply that they've forgotten a lot of these skills. And the biggest thing that you see is exactly what's on your screen. I haven't seen geometry since the 9th grade. Every day practically we'll get a call from someone who's in nursing, who's got an incredibly demanding job and is doing great at it, but hasn't had to simplify fractions in 5 to 10, 20 years. So that's oftentimes the biggest challenge on the GRE. You've got to relearn the basics, so you have to relearn the mathematics, then the algebra, and of course the geometry. There is a calculator on the test, like we'd said, and I mention that because I think it should color how students think about studying for the GRE. So the GRE math section is not a test of your raw computational ability at all, because there's a calculator. Instead, it's a test of, do you know how to set up fairly challenging questions such that they can be answered smoothly in a given set of time. So it's more about understanding how to put equations together and can you solve those equations quickly. The verbal side of the GRE is a little bit more straightforward. In fact, for those of you that remember your SAT and ACT, it's not all that much different from those. It's not all that much more challenging, to be real honest. If you've got a college level vocabulary, most of the skills can be learned to do pretty well pretty quickly. So does that mean that everyone's going to get a perfect score in the GRE verbal? Well, no, not necessarily, but oftentimes it's a little bit more straightforward, and it's a lot more straightforward than the verbal section on the GMAT. Okay, so I think that's the end of our discussion about the GRE and kind of general graduate programs. If there's any other questions, you can definitely knock them out, and we'll have a chance to come back. I'm going to see Allison's putting something in. Allison, I'll definitely get to your question when it comes in. Next section for us to take a look at is law school. Of course, most law school applicants know you're going to have to take the LSAT. For law school, the applications process is very, very numbers driven. And what I mean by that is that more so than pretty much any of the other tests and professional schools that we've talked about, the hardcore numbers are just really, really important. And those are two things. The first is your score on the LSAT, which we're going to talk about a little bit in a second. Secondly, your undergraduate grade point average. Those two together are vastly more important than anything else in your application. And it's one of those things that it sounds bad to say because there's a lot of different things that make applicants unique, a lot of different things to think about. But ultimately, if you don't have the right hard scores for law school, rarely are they going to get too deep into looking at the rest of your application. Now that said, they definitely are looking for a great personal statement. You need to have good letters of recommendation, and then education and work experience is oftentimes the least valuable. You'll probably find, if you haven't already, that for MBA programs, people often have years of work experience. The majority of law students go either right out of college or within a year or two. Not all. I mean, there's certainly a lot of people that go back, but a lot of them will. I got a couple questions about some of the stuff we've gone through before. Let me just knock those out. So Roy says, does admissions take into account professional licensure exams? Yes, in kind of a subjective way. So it's not like you get 5 bonus points for it, but they look at it the same way that they look at other professional achievements. So if you're a person that's highly credentialed in your field, that's a big plus. And that gives them an idea that that you can set your mind to something and then go accomplish hard academic work. So that's a great credential to have. Allison asked a great question, which we're going to get to a little later, but it's a fine time for it. If business schools accept both the GRE and GMAT, what would you recommend taking? So the background on this is that a year or two ago, the makers of the GRE decided to get real serious about competing with the GMAT for MBA admissions. So now at most schools, though not all, you can submit either a GMAT or a GRE score. My recommendation is that if you are going into an MBA program, so like a serious business program, you should still take the GMAT unless you have a really compelling reason not to. The reason in my mind is that the GMAT is a much better exam in terms of really testing those business schools. So when I speak to people that have been on admissions committees, you know, they certainly look at the GRE, and a great GRE is certainly better than a terrible GMAT. But ultimately, Allison and others, you want to take the exam that's specific and that's going to give them a good result. And I think that you'll find as you examine the data that for, especially at the top schools, almost all the students are still taking the GMAT because they know that that's the one that ultimately gets taken, I think, a little bit more seriously by admissions committees. So I think it's GMAT. Now that said, if you already had a GRE score, or for example, if you were applying to a joint degree program at a university, there are definitely instances like that where the GRE is important. If you're going to take the GRE anyway, I'm not sure that. In fact, I would suggest that in most cases you don't have to take both exams. That probably is not going to be a good approach. Okay, so back on law school, we've gone over the admissions criteria a little bit for entrance into law school. LSAT scores and GPA, like we talked about, are really, really critical. And I like to kind of show students this little chart that just shows you roughly what do you need at a couple different law schools. Now, all of this data you can look up easily. If you are a law applicant, you'll become best friends with the website of the Law School Admissions Council, which is lsacc.org. They're sort of the clearinghouse for law school application data, and they also are the creators and administrators of the LSAT exam. So on this chart, let's take, and this is, I'm here in Chicago, so I put a couple Chicago schools on here just because we've got a lot. If you were thinking about DePaul Law School, for example, you can see here that, there we go, that if you look at these two data points, 25th percentile LSAT and 75th percentile LSAT. What this means is that at a school like DePaul, the median 50 percentile of students was between 158 and 162. That's admitted students on their LSAT. So that's a pretty tight range. Now that does mean that 25% of their students were above 162, and probably more importantly, it means that 25% of their students were below a 158. So all hope is not necessarily lost, but when you look at this data, this will give you a pretty good idea. And you can see how radically it changes. So at a school like the University of Chicago, which is routinely ranked the 4th or 5th best law school in the country, they're looking for a really top score. Usually 170 is about the 97th or 98th percentile. The 165 is usually the 90th percentile. So they're really looking for top scores. And then it just depends on the different schools that you can apply to. Briefly, same works for GPA. So at DePaul, half their students are between 3.11 and 3.57. Okay. So there's kind of the rough data. Similarly, as for the other programs, applying early is really, really critical in law school. And it honestly may be the most critical here. The reason is that law schools also roll their admissions. So we talked about the concept of rolling admissions a little bit. There's just more seats available the earlier that you apply. And I've gone to several conferences where pre-law advisors get together with law school admissions folks and law school faculty. Once I just remember asking, it was the dean or maybe the assistant dean of Berkeley Law School, one of the top schools in the country, and I said, hey, what's the one piece of advice that we can give our students on thinking about the LSAT other than get a good score? And she said, take it early. So you really want to make sure that if you're a law school applicant, put your applications in as early as you possibly can. Ignore the deadlines, right? And not ignore them meaning apply later. I mean, when a school says that their application deadline is March 1st, that means that March 1st is just vastly too late for you to have the best chance. Okay. A couple words now about the LSAT. And this stuff, I don't want to go into too much detail here with the test, because you can look all this stuff up online too. The LSAT has 4 multiple choice scored sections, 2 on logical reasoning, which are kind of paragraph length written English logic problems, a section of logic games, which looks sort of like a puzzle that you might do. Like, it ends up looking like sort of like a Sudoku, but not exactly. And then a section of reading comprehension. You'll also have to complete an experimental section, which kind of crops up on the other exams, but not as much, where they're essentially just trying to guinea pig test you on questions that they'll use in future exams. And then also a writing sample, which, unlike GMAT and GRE, is not scored, so you don't have to study too much for the writing sample. In each of those sections, it's going to be 35 minutes. When you think about preparing for the LSAT, ideally, I really like to see students take 3 to 5 months to prepare. I think that more than 6 months is really too long. So that means that either you're just doing too much work, which is rare that I say that, but here's one case, or you're not studying intensely enough. So it's much better to study 10 hours a week for 3 months than it would be to study 5 hours a week for 6 months, or even less. Less than a month, similar to the other exams, is not enough time to reach your top score. So again, you may be already doing so well on the exam just with your natural talents that you can get into several law schools, and maybe even the one that you want, but it really takes a couple months of strenuous preparation to get a top score. Today as we sit, you can definitely study for and take the October 2013 LSAT. The LSAT is offered only 4 times a year, whereas with GMAT and GRE, you can schedule it on your own schedule pretty frequently. LSAT's only 4 times a year. Taking it in October is fine, because that lets you get your applications in before the holiday, before the winter holiday, which is great, right? Because we talked about the rolling admissions, so that's kind of what your goal would be. But if you're doing that, you really need to get started. So we're actually right under 3 months. So there's enough time, but you need to start. If you listen to this recording and it's September 1st, it's too late to study for October. You should think about December instead. So that's if you would like to start law school. If you want to apply for law school this year, fall of 2013, and start in 2014. If you are planning ahead to start law school in fall of 2015, my advice is to plan for the June LSAT and to start studying for that in January or February. And again, it's just this process of the earlier you take it, the better off you'll do. So when students have lots of time to plan ahead, I really suggest taking the June test whenever possible. Okay, I want to say a couple words about medical school, and I'm going to spend the least time here because I think that for most med school applicants, they know a lot about this process already. We don't have too many career changers into medicine, although we do have some. In my opinion, medical school is kind of by far the most challenging admissions process, and it's for a couple different reasons. The first is that med school requires a pretty standardized set of prerequisite courses in a way that none of the other schools do. So for law school, I mean, they really couldn't care less what you studied as an undergraduate. Business school, it's same thing, kind of. I mean, maybe it looks great if you were a math major. That's good. But ultimately, they don't really care. All sorts of majors can go on to business school and to law schools. But whatever you do as an undergrad for med school, you got to make sure that you're taking these prereq courses. You got to have really good grades. So most med school applicants are 3.3 or higher, and hopefully they're higher than that. A lot of letters of recommendation. So usually for MBA and law school and general graduate school, 2 to 3, maybe 4. Med school, it's often 3 to 5. And there's also a lot of sort of outside of academic stuff that you're expected to do to be a competitive candidate. So they're really looking for, have you as a candidate done scientific research in a laboratory? Have you done doctor shadowing, meaning have you followed around a physician, especially in a hospital or in a private practice, and seen what being a doctor is like? And also they're oftentimes looking for community service. So these are often the things that can differentiate students with similar numbers. Most undergraduate institutions, especially the bigger ones, and definitely including Michigan State, have professional offices which help with the medical school admissions process. One of the things that's a little different about med school is that oftentimes instead of kind of you as the student having to run around with your head cut off, getting all these letters and all these different things together from all over campus, oftentimes the Office of Pre-Medical Advising handles a lot of that for students. And that doesn't mean that it's easy or they do all the work. It's actually quite the opposite. But oftentimes the committee for pre-medical studies will write you the most important letter of recommendation. They get all the stuff together that you need in terms of transcripts, and that they just generally are very helpful in that process. If you don't have that stuff, it's going to be a little bit more difficult, and I would suggest maybe looking at contacting some professional help, med school, admissions consultant companies, something to just kind of help you plan the process, because it's not easy. Last thing that makes it a real challenge is that unlike most of the other programs, an average student is not getting into most medical schools. So, we talked about the GMAT average score being about 540. If you got about 540, maybe you had a 3.2 GPA, there's a lot of MBA programs that would love to have you, right? So probably not Harvard Business School, probably not Stanford Graduate School of Business, but your local university would be thrilled to have you come on and pay the tuition. Medical school, for reasons that those of us that frequent doctors probably are happy for, are a little bit more selective. So there's a lot of students that apply to medical school, even with pretty decent credentials, that don't get in. So it's a real challenge. If you're watching our program today and you're considering medical school, and one of the reasons why I didn't spend as much time here is you might already be real engaged in the application process. You kind of got your stuff down, you know what you're doing. If you're not in that camp, maybe you're contemplating a career change, you really should sit down with pre-medical staff. I'd try to get some time with the staff here at Michigan State if you are an MSU alum. Oftentimes you'll need to do some other steps. So a lot of students take a master's, a lot of students take a post-baccalaureate program. So for example, if I decided with my social sciences background that I wanted to be a doctor, I'd probably have to enroll in a master's or post-baccalaureate program, mostly to do all of the undergraduate prerequisites that's required by medical school. So, again, it's a little more challenging a process, and you've got to make sure that you've got great grades in those prereq courses. A couple brief words about the MCAT. There's three sections now. The MCAT's changing, which we'll get to in a second, but there's a section on physical sciences, verbal reasoning, and biological sciences. The MCAT is the only exam that we've talked about today where it's really testing critical thinking and knowledge. So if you think about LSAT and GMAT and GRE, I mean, they test critical thinking, but the knowledge, like the facts that you need to do well on those tests are pretty minimal. I mean, basic rules in mathematics, but that's kind of it. On the MCAT, though, you really need to be up to speed on all the sciences that they cover, and the American Association of Medical Colleges has like this long syllabus of all the topics on the MCAT. And of course, when you purchase prep books or think about a course of tutoring or a prep course, all that stuff is supplied for you. All right. Yeah, I'm going to skip that just in the interest of time today. I'm hitting my ceiling. In 2015, we know that the MCAT is going to be changing. There'll still be biological and physical sciences. The verbal reasoning section will change a little bit. It's called something different, but it's going to be pretty similar. And they're adding a totally new section. It's called Psychological, Social, and Biological Foundations of Behavior, which they're adding because they've gotten some feedback that nothing on the MCAT had really tested sort of more of the soft skills and critical thinking, kind of when interacting with patient skills. So, it's possible to do really well on the MCAT because you're a bright person and you know the sciences, but not to really have a great personality or understanding to work with patients. And this is trying to get at that a little bit more. Whether it's successful, we'll have to see. It's still kind of being put together. And again, that's not till 2015, so you've got a little time. All right, so I was asked to speak for about 45 minutes, and I've got 1 minute left, and I want to spend just that 1 minute talking to you guys about who I am and what we do. So like I said, our company does all one-on-one tutoring. So for our students, we're putting together a customized study plan for each one. They're working individually with an instructor who's able to kind of pinpoint strengths and weaknesses. They're also, compared with the big classes, are working on a much more targeted schedule, and it's also much more customized. So you don't have to wait for any classes to start. We can start with people that are taking the test really any time, and we kind of adapt from there. The reason that our company is successful with our students is that we just got great people. So, you know, Chris has been on my team now for a couple of years, scored a 780 on the GMAT, that's 99th percentile. Rich's been teaching the GRE for 12 years, 9 years at one of our competitors, and then several years with me. Rob, who scored a 175 on the LSAT, which is 99th percentile, and went to Penn for law school, one of the top law schools. And Kirsten has been teaching MCAT for 12 years now. She's got her PhD in chemistry. She's a faculty at one of Michigan State's peer institutions in terms of level 1 research institution. Scored a 40 on the MCAT, which is 99th percentile. So that's a little bit about what we do. I don't want to give you guys a big sales pitch, but if you would like to get in touch with me, if you've got other questions about anything we covered today, I'm more than happy to help you. If you'd like to speak to us about our prep programs, great. You certainly don't have to. Here's my direct information. You get the 800 number from a website, but I invite you to call me directly or email me directly if you like, and let me know if I can help you in any way.
John, I have a few questions to start with as we wait to see if any of our participants have any additional questions to put in our chat area. What about the mental side of the exam? We interact with individuals who have test anxiety and such. What recommendations do you have for individuals in terms of strategy, resources, for getting a handle on the mental component?
Sure. Yeah, that's important too, for sure. The first way that you manage stress on tests is by being very familiar with the format and the material. So, you know, oftentimes we'll have people call us that are just starting out, and they'll say, "Oh, I have such terrible test anxiety." And you would kind of say, "Hey, well, you're just starting out." I mean, if I had to sit down and take, for example, the MCAT, where personally, I don't know the sciences on that test. I mean, our company does it, but I don't touch it. I would have no idea what to do, and that's a big part of what causes stress. If you still have a lot of anxiety later on, as you're more familiar, then you can think about doing things like every 10 minutes you take a 10-second break to kind of collect yourself and make sure that you're still making the right progress and just kind of not stress out. And the other thing that I mentioned with all 4 of these exams, and hopefully this kind of reduces pressure a little bit, you can take them again. So with all these programs, you take the test twice. No one blinks an eye on the admissions committees. Pass 2 times, you start running into a little bit of problems with it, but you do have usually a couple tries to get these things right.
Have you noticed any gender or cultural biases in these tests that people might need to be prepared for and address their study habits?
I don't know that I've seen any gender biases. There's certain aspects of the test that are kind of culturally aligned, I guess I would say. The biggest one being on the GMAT. Part of the verbal section tests the way that you structure sentences, so the sentence corrections section for anyone who's seen the GMAT a little bit before. And one of the things that they test are idioms. So the expressions in English that someone who wasn't a United States English speaker might just have no idea what you're talking about. So I should have thought of an example. It's going to take me a second to think of an example, but that's definitely one of the things that you have to kind of adjust for. Now, there's a reason that that's being tested, which is that as you go into business school and then onto a business career, you're going to be expected to kind of know how to operate in U.S. English. So that's, I think, why they test it. Ultimately, that's something that can be conquered. So that's something where you can kind of study the different formats. It's also one of those things where, especially for students that are international or who English is their second or third or fourth language, oftentimes I'll suggest that they read a lot in the English language as they're studying, and a lot of kind of dense material as well. So oftentimes we'll suggest to students that they get a subscription to The Economist, for example, because The Economist has these kind of 3 to 4 paragraph articles that are very dense that really mirror the structure oftentimes of reading comp sections on some of the different exams.
That's good, great information. In terms of the essays, I've worked with individuals who have really struggled on that component, and it almost feels like that cover letter process for a resume at times, where they find their essay is just very flat with I did this, I like this, I'm passionate about type of thing. Can you give us some ideas of what individuals should be thinking about when they're crafting some of these essays?
Absolutely. There's a couple kind of just overall tips that I think about that I think really apply across all the different personal essay types. The first is that it's got to be personal, and that sounds obvious, but I read a lot of drafts of personal statements that end up being like more about someone else, and the admissions committees really want to know about you. So, like an example is, for example, if someone wrote an essay about how they were really inspired by a professor that they had at college, and it turns out that a page and a half of 2 pages is about that professor, or is about that supervisor, whoever it might be. Really make sure that your own unique personality comes out in these essays. And again, I mean, it's such trite advice to be yourself, but be yourself. For most competitive programs, they've got way more applications who are well qualified and who would do well in the program that they can take. So they're really looking to kind of differentiate, the same 155 LSAT, 3.6 GPA from all the rest of them that they have in their pile. Another tip that I would give, which is kind of similar, is you want to come across as a person that they would be interested in sitting down with and hanging out with, maybe even socially. And that's probably not going to happen. But just when I sit down with people that really read these for a living, that have been on admissions committees in each of the different fields, the first thing that they talk about is there's some essays that make the applicants come off as kind of a jerk, and you just want to make sure that even as you're talking about how great your accomplishments are, that you're kind of tempering that with an element of humility, an element of maybe humor about yourself and your background. Those would be some ideas. And then I guess the final one, which is another pet peeve from admissions committees, is make sure to follow the length requirements really carefully. You don't want to write something too long, because there's nothing that admissions committee people like more than to talk about, oh, I was reading this great essay, but it went past the 3-page limit, so I stopped. Right? That really happens. So just make sure that you're following the directions in terms of limits, and also in terms of topic, which is a whole other story.
Right. I'm thinking of an example in terms of an individual that we worked with at Michigan State who was applying for medical school, but he was really interested in going the DO route versus the MD route. But he wasn't in his essays or in his personal statements making it clear why the DO path was so important to him. And when he actually tailored his essay around that and made it more specific to, yes, I want to be a DO, he actually got much better results, much quicker.
Yeah, that's a really good tip, and it's one to keep in mind when you're writing to schools where it might not be immediately apparent why you're applying there. So let me give you some examples of kind of what I mean. I worked with an LSAT student this year who's in Chicago. He goes to Loyola University Chicago here. He's lived in Chicago all his life. He's from here. You look at his resume, and it's just 10 lines: Chicago, 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 Chicago. And I was like, okay, I was chatting with him one day. He's like, where do you want to go to law school? He's like, I want to go to the University of Alabama. And I was like, okay, well, why? He's like, well, turns out that he's marrying his girlfriend, so his fiance. Their family's from there. That's where they want to be. And when you write an essay to a school where it's not really clear exactly why you might be applying, that's one of those places where you want to write something a little customized. And sometimes it's obvious. So if you are, you're applying to business school and you've got a great background and you're applying to Harvard Business School, it's obvious why you're applying to Harvard Business School, right? Because it's great, right? Because it's one of the most prestigious schools. But if you're applying to somewhere that maybe is on the other side of the country, or maybe it's a different, at least like you said, a different kind of program, then it would be immediately obvious that would be a good fit for you. You want to talk a little bit about that, just so they have an idea that if they admit you, that you'll really want to come.
Yeah. In terms of the letters of recommendations, are there certain types of content that it might be wise for individuals to in a way, prep the individuals who are writing these letters for them to cover?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple answers to that. The first is that for every student, one of the steps in creating or in getting letters of recommendation is that you should spend a couple hours putting together a little packet for your recommenders. Especially if you're a college student and you're getting a rec from a professor, they get like 4,000 requests for recommendations all at the same time of the year, pretty much. So if you were their like lab assistant for 3 years, of course they can write you a good letter. But for a lot of students who are not as well known by the professors, I mean, maybe you took 3 classes with them and you got an A on all the papers. You want to include a copy of your resume. You want to include a copy of your personal statement draft if you have one. And you want to make it more of a personal appeal. So don't do it by email unless you know the person really well enough. Usually you'll go to office hours and say, hey, could you write me a great letter of recommendation? Here's all the materials I have prepared for you. To Lisa, to your specific question, yeah, if there's an element of your background that you'd really like to get covered that might not be covered as well, and you know one of your writers really, really well, such that you kind of feel comfortable saying, hey, Professor X, I'd like for this letter to talk a little bit more about my quantitative skills because that didn't come out in my coursework. I didn't take a lot of math courses, and the one I took I got a B. But you and I had worked together in the lab. And we did all these great calculations. Would you mind maybe as part of the letter talking about my quantitative skills? That I think would be totally appropriate.
And if you've been away from an academic setting for a while, let's say you're taking the GRE 15 years out of college, is there a downside to not having academic references?
For the GRE
letters of recommendation
and the GMAT, I think that's totally fine. And in fact, especially on the GMAT, there's the expectation that you'll have been out of college for at least 2 to 6 years before you consider business school at all. So that I think is totally fine. Law school admissions committees tend to really like at least one academic letter. Med school admissions committees, I mean, that's almost a requirement, but that's usually a little bit easier. So if you're a law school candidate, you've been out of school for a long time, it's okay. Your age will kind of come through in your resume, and that will be clear. But if you are graduating college, if you graduated college, a month ago, and you don't have an academic letter for law school, that's going to look a little bit suspicious. Probably looks a little suspicious for the GRE as well. So I think that when you can have a professor, you probably should.
Gotcha. Well, we are just about at the stopping point for this webcast today, so I want to ask you, John, if you have any closing thoughts, and then we'll close out. I see Matt's typing a quick question, too.
No pressure, Matt. my closing thought before thank you very much for saying that. My closing thoughts are just start this process early. The biggest mistake that people make that's avoidable is just not starting. If you want to go to school next fall, start now. Start doing the research, going through all the stuff we talked about today. Other than that, hey, thanks for taking the time to listen, and good luck.
Yeah, and I just want to take an additional moment to say thank you to you, John. You're a great Spartan. You've been reaching out to us for a while, offering to help across campus, and I know it's sincere and genuine. And for those of you who are considering working with an organization, even if you're not in Chicago, John has resources around the country. We've heard wonderful things about the work he's done, and I hope you can tell from how effectively he addressed today's content that he knows his stuff. So thank you to those of you who joined the cast. Our next webcast in the MSUA Professional Series will take place on the 25th, 2 Thursdays from now, and that will cover managing the immigration process for corporations. So entirely different topic, but you are welcome to join us for that if it interests you. And you can register for any of our casts at alumni.msu.edu/professional series. So thank you, John. For those who are interested in a recording of this cast, up on the top of the chat area, you will see an email for Brenda Haynes. You may email her, and she will gladly send you a copy of today's cast. Thank you, and go green.